Welcome once again to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you all for being here. This is a particularly appropriate day to be holding an event on bilateral relations. It's almost as if we planned it. As you all know, the President will be arriving in Mexico later on today. We thought this was a particularly appropriate time to launch the printed version of our new report, New Ideas for a New Era, Policy Options for the Next Stage in U.S. Mexico Relations. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. Beside me, I have Christopher Wilson, who is an associate with the Mexico Institute. Eric Olson, who is the associate director of the Latin America program. Miguel Salazar, who is our communications and media expert in the Mexico Institute and also does great work on migration. And Andrew Seeley, somebody that some of you may know around this table, who used to have my job and is now the vice president in charge of programming at the Wilson Center and obviously a senior advisor to the Mexico Institute as well. We have about an hour and a half, and as with most of these sessions, it's much better if we get our work out of the way relatively quickly. We sort of lay some basic ideas on the table, and then we can open it up for a more active discussion. So without further ado, let me just launch in. I've just come back from a week's trip to Mexico and then to California, and the subject that kept coming up time and time again was Mexico's image internationally. And there's this extraordinary a divergence that's going on right now, so that around the world, so many people seem to be saying that Mexico is good news, good news, good news. Whereas in Mexico, you see all of this pushback right now, whether it's the traditional Mexican pessimism about their own situation, or whether it's skepticism about the way in which the government is pushing forward a message about Mexico. The result is that we have two distinct realities. And finally, these two realities are coming together. In the press, international press over the past few days, we've begun to see more stories coming out, first of all, from the Los Angeles Times, then from the New York Times, stories coming out about how not all is well necessarily in the bilateral relationship. This creates the perfect opportunity for us to discuss in a more nuanced and sophisticated way exactly what's going on both within Mexico and in the bilateral relationship. I think all of us here at this table have received so many calls from the press and the media over the past week asking us exactly what is going to be said in the bilateral meeting between the two presidents. And we've all been speculating based upon our many conversations that we've had here in Washington and in Mexico City. And we've been, pushing forward various issues that are going to be on the table. But it's the question that keeps coming up is to say, so how much of the meeting is going to be about security? How much of the meeting is going to be about economics? Really, is this going to be just a massaging of the message in the meeting? And I think that what we see today is that there is a great deal of substances on the table. It may be that the public communique that comes out at the end of this meeting may not reflect the substance that was actually discussed behind closed doors, the substance that has been being discussed for the past few weeks here in Washington and in Mexico City. I think it's extraordinary to see the intensity that the bilateral relationship has reached in recent weeks. The number of people who have been high-level cabinet members who have been flying up from Mexico City to Washington, and high-level U.S. government representatives flying down to Mexico City. As one U.S. government representative said a couple of weeks ago, in Washington these days, every week is Mexico Week. And I thought that was a kind of a lovely expression to demonstrate how high level the intensity is right now. One of the challenges that the two presidents are going to be facing, certainly in terms of their public message, is to determine whether we're going beyond just that message about economic competitiveness, education and innovation, to really hit at the core of what the new relationship is all about. In discussions that I was involved in yesterday out in California, it was interesting to see that a lot of us are saying, well, it takes a long time for a new relationship to really get into its groove. The new government in Mexico is still essentially trying to work out what its security strategy is. It's trying to get the wheels to hit the road on this. And that means that it's very, very difficult for them to actually come down, to sit down with the United States and to lay out how they want to collaborate with the United States. And I know that Eric will talk a lot more about this later on. But it's intriguing to see how those, what have been named frictions and tensions in the relationship, are playing out over time. Now, my own particular area of research and the chapter that I contributed to this book on bilateral relations is on energy. And I would say that after security, that's the issue that many people have been asking me about, not so much in terms of the bilateral relationship, but very much in terms of, so what's going to happen in Mexico? Now, as you are all aware, it looks as though between August and December of this year, there will be an energy reform proposal presented by the Peña Nieto government, and that's what everybody is focusing on. And people always ask me, well, so what are the prospects for collaboration between Mexico and the United States based upon this energy reform? And the problem is, it's all going to be speculation. The speculation is because we really don't know what's going to be in that reform. We have an idea based upon what the government of Mexico has been messaging up to this point, that it will involve a reform of Pemex. It'll involve an opening of the sector to allow Pemex to sign joint ventures with foreign and private firms. Hopefully it will involve the creation of a new regulator. The implications for that, of that reform, if that's in fact what happens for relations with the United States, are multiple. And I would say that perhaps the most interesting area that we can look at there is first of all the shale gas sector. Mexico, as many of you know, has the world's fourth largest reserves of shale gas, and a lot of it is located in the north of the country, which is essentially an extension of the Eagle Ford shale gas formation in Texas. Now, the United States, or rather the United States companies, have become world leaders in exploiting shale gas reserves. And many of these firms are actually small firms, very, very small and agile, and have developed not only the technology, but also the technique and the expertise to be able to do this very efficiently. Pemex, on the other hand, in Mexico, is a very, very big international oil company which doesn't do this kind of thing particularly well because it's a behemoth. It doesn't move very quickly, and that's what you need to do when you're exploiting shale. So what I've discussed in the paper in this publication is the possibility for U.S. firms, if there is an opening of the hydrocarbon sector in Mexico, there's the possibility for U.S. firms to really be leaders in working alongside Mexican firms and alongside Pemex in developing Mexico's shale gas reserves. Now, the reason why it makes sense is because these firms already have the geological knowledge to go in there. It would be entirely familiar territory for them. I'm not saying that there are no obstacles that would exist in the way of that. There are many environmental issues up in the north of Mexico involving water use, and there are of course a number of security concerns that firms will be worried about. But I would see that U.S. firms will really be leaders, leading the charge into Mexico if that change does happen. In terms of the Gulf of Mexico and Mexico's deep water reserves, it's likely that if we do see a constitutional reform in Mexico that allows for an opening of the sector, that allows for Pemex to enter into joint ventures for exploration and production in deep waters in the Gulf of Mexico, then we will see that U.S. firms will be active in seeking to ally themselves with Pemex in those areas. Whether or not they will be the first firms in is unclear. A lot of people have speculated that the most acceptable partners in the initial phases of a new reformed system would be a national oil company from a developing country such as Petrobras, for example. It would sort of smooth the way in. Beyond oil and gas, however, there are serious questions and opportunities as well for collaboration in terms of infrastructure, the building of cross-border electricity transmission. I'm hoping that at the end of the meeting between the two presidents, there will be an announcement that there will be some new energy injected into the process of building cross-border transmission. One of the biggest problems facing Mexico right now is the fact that there is not a fully integrated electricity market with the United States. And there are significant efficiency and cost gains to be made by importing electricity from the United States at certain times a day and also exporting electricity from Mexico to the United States, particularly from renewable sources in places like Baja California. Other infrastructure questions that are crucial here are the building of cross-border natural gas pipelines. Whilst Mexico has these enormous shale gas reserves, it's going to be years before they're fully developed. And in the short term, there are shortages of gas in Mexico, which are causing significant headaches for the private sector. A lot of private sector firms are paying way over the cost for natural gas because they're having to buy imported LNG rather than buying natural gas that's being pumped over the border from the United States, where it sells for around $3 per million BTUs. A lot of them are paying up to $21 per million BTU just because it's coming in the form of imported LNG. That's a serious problem for competitiveness and productivity in Mexico at this point. I expect that over the years that come, we're going to see new investments to build cross-border pipelines. Already we've seen one major project underway to bring natural gas in from the United States, and then furthermore for Mexico to build its natural gas pipeline throughout the country to make sure that the entire country is served by that. Thinking long term, there are great opportunities for renewable energy in Mexico. There's great opportunities for further collaboration because cooperation already exists between the two countries on building a smart grid in Mexico. There's been a pilot project in Mexico, which has been funded by the U.S. government to develop smart grid technology in Mexico. And thinking very, very long term, we have the possibility for collaboration on the question of the carbon tax or cap and trade systems for North America as a region. And it may be something that we're not ready to discuss at a national level here in the United States, but at some point it is going to come, and the two countries are quite aware of that. Energy efficiency is another issue which is on the table. The two countries have collaborated quite significantly in the past, and pushing energy efficiency issues forward into the next level will be of enormous interest to people within the Ministry of Energy in Mexico and the private sector. A lot of firms such as Pemex have already invested, such as Walmart have already invested heavily in energy efficiency measures and have become leaders both within Mexico and within the region on this issue. And they're actively looking to get national standards set for energy efficiency within Mexico. With that, I will leave it and pass over to my colleague Chris Wilson, who's going to talk about the economy and border affairs in bilateral relations. Many thanks.
Yeah, just switch the. There's another podium. It's open. This one? Yeah, if you could just flip that one. Thanks a lot. All right, good morning. First of all, I wanted to thank some of the people that helped us get this report together that aren't sitting up here right now, including Ashley Garcia, our intern, and Pedro, who's not here right now, and especially Ali Cordell for both help with the book and for help getting this event together. Thanks a lot. I wrote on both economic issues, economic relations between the U.S. and Mexico, and border issues, and I'm going to just very briefly touch on each of those topics, and then we can get into some more depth on any of those topics that you'd be interested in during the question and answer period. As a starting point, I guess, both governments have really agreed that we should be focusing more on economic relations right now. Probably one side of that is that they'd like to have less focus on the sort of drugs and violence and some of the negative stories that had, really topped the press and topped conversations about Mexico over the last several years. But getting past that, there's a real logic to it. There's a lot of, there is a good news story to tell, and there's a reason why we should focus on economic relations, and there are things that can be gained from conversations about economic relations. So what are they? Well, I guess the sort of starting point, and I'll do this as briefly as I can, in terms of why we should focus on economic relations, is that trade between the United States and Mexico is massive. We just, if you add together preliminary estimates of services trade for the past year and look at the merchandise trade for the last year, we find that we're now trading over $1 million a minute between the United States and Mexico. It's just this huge quantity of trade between the two countries that means we need to be working together to take advantage of it and to, when possible, boost that trade even more. So we're at over $500 billion a year, over $1 million a minute in trade. But trade's not just big, it's also unique in how deep it is, in the nature of trade between the United States and Mexico. And that's really about production sharing. We have parts that go back and forth across the border many times. I was just talking to folks at Caterpillar, a company based in Illinois here in the U.S. that has operations in Monterrey and Nuevo Laredo, a few other parts of Mexico. You know, they tell me they have parts that cross the border 9 or 10 times during the lifespan of a product as it you know, a widget goes into a fuel injector, goes into a motor, goes into a truck that's sold back to another country, and then they remanufacture it later back and forth between two countries. We're just tightly intertwined in the way that we trade to one another. And maybe the best indicator of that is that 40% of our imports from Mexico to the United States are actually products built in the United States or parts or materials built in the U.S. So even our imports from Mexico actually support jobs and industry in the United States in a way that's really unique, because if you compare that to a place like China, the comparative figure is 4%. So 4 cents of every dollar we spend on imports from China stays here in the United States, while 40% of that same dollar spent on imports from Mexico would stay here in the U.S. Our economies are really tightly intertwined, and our productivity and our competitiveness are very much intertwined. It's also a good time to focus on the economic relationship because Mexico's economy is doing pretty well. This just shows how Mexico's economy has sort of outperformed the U.S. economy over the last few years, which has not always been the case. But while Mexico's economy is growing faster than the U.S., we can tap into Mexico's growth as a source of growth for the United States to the extent that we can deepen the economic relationship. And finally, the development of advanced manufacturing techniques is making unskilled labor a shrinking part of the cost of production worldwide, but especially in places that have access to and are implementing better advanced manufacturing techniques, higher technology in their production. What does that mean? It means that companies that during the 90s and early 2000s looked at wages around the world and decided they were going to chase those cheap wages and put their production wherever they could find the cheapest source of wages, now can think of things a little bit differently. As labor becomes a smaller piece of the production cost, there's greater incentives to reevaluate some of those decisions that were made previously, and really to have a more comprehensive, integral, holistic view of figuring out where production does make the most sense. That means we're looking at exchange rate risk, we're looking at regulatory frameworks, we're looking at transportation costs. There are a whole group of factors that maybe during the earlier stages of globalization weren't quite as well understood as to how they would affect manufacturing. And as companies sort of reevaluate their bottom lines for each product, this is different for every type of product, whether it's a car or a t-shirt, it's going to sort of add up, it's going to have its own math. But companies are finding increasingly that bringing production back to the United States or Mexico or both is increasingly a good option for them. Some of the industries in particular that are where those kind of calculations are working out are things like the automotive industry, aerospace, some electronics, petrochemicals. There's sort of a slew of things going on there that are really interesting and present some opportunities for the United States and Mexico. These are sort of you probably can't even read them, but they're all in the book. These are just the sort of quick recommendations from the economics chapter, and I just want to focus on two very briefly right now. First is cooperating on global trade issues. At a time when the United States and Mexico, along with Canada, are involved in the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, at a time when the United States is looking to begin negotiations with the European Union for a trade deal, a trade investment deal, and we should note that Canada is concluding a similar deal with Europe right now, that Mexico already has a deal in place with the EU. We should be thinking about how our countries can be working together to negotiate these agreements, or to at least make sure the puzzle pieces all fit together. Because the thing is, if we are producing goods together, and we are, our manufacturing production platforms are very integrated, we should be thinking about how to get those goods to market around the world together. We should be making sure that goods that are produced in the U.S., which are also goods produced in Mexico, get the preferred access to whatever markets either one of our countries are negotiating with. That means it makes more sense to work together on these global trade issues. So we should be, for example, coordinating our positions at the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, and we should be really thinking about if it may be too difficult to get Mexico at the table in a U.S.-EU trade negotiation. That may be a bridge too far. If that is the case, if that's not possible to get Mexico at the table with the U.S., then I think we should really think about how to coordinate positions with Mexico so that the goods produced by both countries together have that access to the EU market that certainly EU as an already integrated bloc will be getting to each of the countries of North America. The second issue is facilitating greater U.S. Mexico private sector and civil society dialogue on economic issues. And this just sort of, I sort of look back to the NAFTA era when NAFTA was being negotiated and it was being implemented. There was this tremendous amount of energy that the private sector and civil society brought to the relationship. They organized themselves in a binational way. They lobbied, they talked to members of Congress, they created pieces of the policy agenda. And this has sort of subsided over the years as NAFTA has slid off the table and as migration and security have risen to the top of the agenda. Well, as economic issues are coming back to the top of the agenda, it makes a lot of sense to look for ways to reignite this dialogue. And really, I think it's in the government's interest, both the United States and Mexican governments, to try to foment these dialogues, because it will be only in collaboration with those groups that public opinion can be mobilized. You know, we're sort of still in some ways stuck in the dialogue of evaluating NAFTA really on the same terms that we were trying to evaluate NAFTA before it was even implemented. Instead of looking at where we're at today, which is tremendous amount of integration, we're really not competitors but partners, and just sort of taking that as the starting point and then having a discussion, a dialogue of what the private sector would like from government, what civil society would like from government, so that we can have, robust economic growth, but widespread development at the same time. I'm going to move on to border issues right now, and there's obviously within the border a million things we could talk about. We could talk about migration, we could talk about public security, drug trafficking, the movement of guns and cash south into Mexico, environmental issues, more economic issues, regional economic development. There's so many issues that really come to a head at the border, but I guess I should say, fortunately, in the next couple of weeks, we'll be releasing from the Wilson Center in collaboration with our partners at Arizona State University and the Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana, a comprehensive state of the border report. And we'll get to have a much deeper conversation about all of these issues at that point. So right now, I'm just going to try to bring up one sort of interesting finding from this work and then talk about one or two recommendations again. So this chart here, it shows the increase in merchandise trade compared and indexed with the increase or sort of lack thereof of truck entries from Mexico. And this is sort of a really interesting thing because trade is up 78% since 2000 in terms of its value, but truck crossings are only up 8%. And that's what this graph shows. So somehow and for some reason, even though trade has been booming over the last several years between the United States and Mexico, the number of trucks actually crossing the border is not booming in anywhere close to the same way. We can attribute a little bit of this to inflation and some just sort of technical pieces of the puzzle, but there's a lot more to it than that. And I think what that really shows is something that probably a lot of you have heard before, is that the border has thickened since 9/11. Increased security has been real, and there have been real gains in security, but they have come, unfortunately, at a cost in terms of economics to the trade that happens between the two countries. It's a new source or an increased source of friction. So during the 90s with NAFTA, we got rid of a lot of the friction in terms of tariffs between the two countries for trade. And unfortunately, some of that has returned, not in the form of tariffs, but in the form of non-tariff barriers, wait times at the border, more difficulties in terms of some other policy issues there. So I think this shows in an interesting way what that challenge is that we have to do. For some reason, truckers and companies are figuring out ways to cram more value into each truck because they don't want to make those 4 or 5 truck trips across the border every day. They'd rather make a couple less because it's taking a lot of time to make them, and it's taking a lot of money to make them. So again, I think you probably can't see these recommendations, but I'll just focus on one for now, and we can get into some of the other ones during the question and answer. The one I want to focus on is that I think we should really focus more on the ports of entry when we talk about border management, and a little bit less on the areas between the ports of entry. You know, a lot of people don't even know, but from a U.S. perspective, there's two different pieces of Customs and Border Protection that manage each of those two different parts of the border. It's the Border Patrol that patrols the areas between the ports of entry, wearing green uniforms, and the OFO, the Office of Field Operations, which is another part of CBP that works at the ports of entry themselves. These are both important law enforcement operations for the U.S. government, but we focus different amounts of attention on each of them, more on the areas between the ports of entry in recent years and less on the area at the ports of entry. And so this is really a comprehensive issue, both in terms of security. There's reasons to look more at the ports of entry. Most hard drugs, for example, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin tends to come through the ports of entry, not the areas around it. But it's also, at the same time, an issue of economic competitiveness, as I was mentioning before. Competitiveness is really, it's cut away because of this congestion that's at the border. And those same delays and congestion make the binational way of life, the sort of the culture, the fabric of life at the border, which is really, it's this really interesting binational existence that has really important consequences, not just socially, but also economically, as people shop across the border, go to college across the border, visit their families across the border. Well, that's sort of breaking down in a small way. It's still there in a big way, but in a small way, it's breaking down because it's harder to get across the border every day. And so I think we need to find ways to both increase security, or at least not lose in terms of security, while increasing competitiveness, while increasing the ability for families to cross the border. So some of the ways we can do that are trusted traveler and trusted shipper programs, Sentry, FAST, customs pre-clearance, some investments in staffing and infrastructure at the ports of entry, finding ways, a legal framework for public-private partnerships to take place so that the private money that's out there in the cities, the local governments that have money that they'd like to put on the table so that we can improve our management of the border, of the ports of entry, have a legal framework in which they can do that. And that's something that's been a challenge previously. There are some little projects, some interesting examples there, but it's very limited, and there's a lot more that could be done. So as I said, there's a lot more we could talk about, but let me just leave it there for now. Thanks a lot.
Eric? Great, thank you. And I just want to say a word of thanks to my colleagues at the Mexico Institute for the opportunity to participate in this study. It's a very interesting time in Mexico and U.S. relations, especially in the area of security. So it's been fun in that nerdy, quirky sort of way to continue to follow these issues. I thought what I would start out with is kind of almost reminding ourselves of three of the big themes on security policy that began to emerge during the presidential campaign last year and really have been the new directions, if I could use our phrase of the morning, the new areas in which the Peña Nieto government has tried to maneuver and develop and propose its new policies. And I would say that those new policies are still very much under development, but you get a sense of the direction, at least, in which they're going. The first one is that began to emerge strongly in the last years of the Calderon administration and very much during the campaign was this issue of violence reduction. We've talked about it all already. There was a sense in which with 70,000 or so people having died during that 6-year period, 25,000 or so disappeared, you had a horrendous body count that in and of itself became an issue. Until late in the Calderon administration, the violence was often talked about as a regrettable side impact, a regrettable outcome of this aggressive policy. But at some point, and we could debate at what point, the violence itself became the issue. And needing to deal with that and reduce the violence associated with organized crime became an issue. And Peña Nieto very much spoke to that in his campaign, and his policies have continued to try to speak to the need to reduce violence. That, at least in Mexico, is pretty much a non-controversial topic. What you do about it is a little more complicated, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's one of the themes that emerged. A second theme that emerged out of the Calderon administration in the campaign and has continued on is what I would call better policy coordination, policy coherence. There was a lot of criticism of the Calderon administration that there was not good coordination between the different elements of the federal government. The federal police didn't talk well with the military. They didn't talk so well or coordinate so well with CISEN, the intelligence gathering unit. And the coordination from federal, state, and local was also an issue. Sometimes it wasn't bad, but in general there was poor coordination between all these various levels of government and the various institutions of government. And Peña Nieto said they were going to do something to change the architecture and create better policy coordination between the three levels of government and within the federal government. The third thing that emerged was this desire, and we've already mentioned it several times, to rebalance the relationship with the United States. As my colleagues Chris and Duncan have said, there was a desire to talk about Mexico in a more holistic way, and to emphasize some of the good things going on in Mexico. After all, the news had been overwhelmingly tragic during much of the 6 years, and it was, it begins to wear down on people. And there are a lot of wonderful things about Mexico. So the need to highlight those other elements, the energy, the economic opportunity, the growth of the country. One of the ways in which they began to do that is to change where the policy debate and discussions were happening. I may be oversimplifying here, but in some ways, what resulted in this changing architecture is the economic issues, the broad reform issues were really dealt with much more at a presidential level, and we saw security issues become much more coordinated at the level of Gobernación, the Internal Affairs Ministry, and the Internal Affairs Ministry kind of returned to its old role of policy coordinator within the government, concentration of security functions under Gobernación, and as a result, you see Secretary Osorio Chong taking the lead in the relationship with the United States in a way that didn't happen as much under the Calderon administration. Calderon himself was deeply personally engaged even from before he took office. He brought it to his first meeting with George W. Bush and said, we need your involvement, we need U.S. engagement on this issue. It was a very personal issue where a lot of decisions were coming out of Presidencia or the presidential offices, and that this new structure really pushed that now much more to Gobernación. So these are the sort of changes that were discussed and we begin to see emerge. Now, the question is, and it's always a tough question to answer so early in the process, what's been the impact of this? What do we see now? And I admit up front that, again, what are we into the 5th month of the Peña Nieto administration? 6th month if we're Optimistic. So it's a little, premature to come to some kind of conclusion, but I think we can begin to see how things are changing in the relationship. First of all, as we've already said, the architecture has changed, and Gobernación has become, in my estimations, what in Spanish is often called the ventanilla única. How do we say that in English? The single window. One-stop shopping. And there's a rationale for that. If you want better policy coordination, it's nice to have a place where the buck stops and everybody's in charge. But I think, in addition to that, some questions have emerged, and especially this week, as this relationship between the United States that grew up over the last 6 years appears to be changing in the context of this new architecture, of this nueva ventanilla única. And the point there being that under the Calderón administration, U.S. law enforcement, U.S. intelligence, U.S. Military to some extent, had much more direct relationships with the agencies themselves. The U.S. Attorney General's office had a much clearer relationship with the Attorney General's office in Mexico, DEA, with the police, and there were this kind of complex network of relationships that emerged. And many of them were institutional, but a lot of them were personal relationships of trust that were built up over time. And we saw that on many of our visits, people at the border who learned to trust and actually greatly respect their counterparts on the other. They would pick up the phone and talk to one another. And there was that kind of dynamism. What we see now is maybe a stepping back from that somewhat. Maybe the creation of more focused coordination, if not control, of those relationships, and a statement from the government, from Osorio Chong, that says, this is going to change, and those relationships need to be coordinated now through Gobernación much more. I suspect that many of those personal relationships will continue, but over time, if there's more focus and coordination, it will have an impact, there's no question. The second issue of violence reduction, again, a widely held a consensus in favor of violence reduction. But what's less clear is exactly how the government plans to accomplish that, reach that goal. They've defined or outlined three broad areas for that. One is a strong focus on prevention. Investment in prevention programs for young people who don't have access to quality education, don't have access to good jobs, and are living in a situation of vulnerability or at risk of being caught up in criminal activity. So a strong focus in that direction, the specifics of which are not yet fully understood or not fully described. Secondly, the creation of specialized police units that would focus on the most violent crimes. And this is an important point because we in the United States tend to think of the real problem in Mexico as transnational organized crime, bringing cocaine up from Colombia, and that should be the focus. And obviously that is an important aspect here. I don't want to minimize it. But for Mexicans themselves, what they experienced more in terms of violence is the daily extortion, the threat of kidnapping, the kind of violence that occurs on their street corners that in some way may be related to the bigger trade in cocaine, but it really is about local criminal networks and local activities in places like Monterrey or Acapulco and so on and so forth. So the government was talking about creating specialized police or law enforcement units focused on kidnapping and extortion, something that had not existed before. There's a challenge there because those crimes in Mexico are considered local crimes. So it's not entirely clear how the federal authorities would play a role. They may have to change the law. There's a lot of questions there. But that was another focus to try to reduce the violence associated with these other kinds of criminal activity. And third, the formation or the announced formation of a gendarmerie, a special civilian militia, probably stood up with using former military, designed to provide support and rapid response to areas of the country where violence may be particularly acute and where local and state authorities are not able to respond. In some ways, maybe a substitute to some degree for deploying the military or finding new ways to use the military rather than simply patrolling streets. Now, these are all, in my estimation, good and worthy goals and important things to do, but I think the government faces some real challenges in defining how these are going to happen, each one of these, and actually implementing them. And the challenge in particular is that these will take time. Standing up the gendarmerie is not a short-term solution. It's not even probably a medium-term solution. It could take a year, it could take a year and a half, and there's still a lot of questions over who will command and control the gendarmerie, the military or civilians. So there's a lot of issues there. And I think then what becomes the default between now and when all this new architecture and new initiatives are in place, to some extent becomes one falling back on much of what Calderon did. And secondly, and this is where it gets complicated, there's a sense that the focus is more on messaging. The focus is more on form than substance. I'm not saying that that's what's happening, but there's a risk that if you don't address these issues up front and define clearly with timelines how you're going to approach these problems, how you're going to reduce violence and show and demonstrate results, that then it becomes a question of messaging rather than actual substantive change. So for me, one of the real challenges for Mexico, for Peña Nieto, and for the U.S. and Mexico together is to ensure that we don't get stuck in changes of form that then are not followed up with significant substantive changes. Some of the issues that we recommend in our report are not even being discussed right now. Our report, which we originally wrote back at the end of last year, focused heavily on the need for institutional reform, moving ahead with professionalization of the police, professionalization of local and state police, moving ahead on the advances in judicial reform and making those a reality. Progress has been made under the last administration, and there's been at least a verbal commitment to continue those, but the actual action, the substance of it, the willingness to make those a priority have not been highlighted in the speech thus far. And so if, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, if in the meeting with Peña Nieto and Obama, security is touched on very lightly with no real commitment to these issues, doesn't mean it won't happen, but the impression one gets is that they become second level, second tier, third tier issues, and that sends an important and potentially negative signal. So I think our recommendations from this report is not to allow those institutional issues, the need to professionalize and reform, to suddenly fall off the agenda entirely, but to really invest the resources and the political capital needed to make them more of a reality. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Miguel.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks all of you for being here this morning. Mexico U.S. migration is of great importance, as we all know, for historical reasons, for cultural reasons, and this has led to some deep and sustained ties between the two countries, as we've already noticed from the rest of the panel discussants here. However, U.S. Mexico migration doesn't quite always factor into the bilateral policy discussion at the same level that other issues like security and like economic integration do. That said, there are some changes that have occurred recently in the landscape that allow us greater opportunities to expand collaborative efforts on issues of migration. And there are steps that policymakers in both the U.S. and in Mexico can take to ensure that we're having a predictable flow of migrants in the current legal environment, but also set up conditions for better solutions for future flows of migration. So I'm going to quickly highlight 3 areas after I talk about changing demographics, and those 3 areas are going to be enforcement regimes, human capital development, and legal reforms. So first I want to turn to the changing circumstances of migration in the U.S. Now, in the U.S., migrants are going to serve a strategic interest. They have served and they will continue to serve this interest for us. They're going to help us maintain our growth rates as we experience a society with declining numbers of population growth. We're going to need migrants to ensure that we have that we're adequately supplying our workforce needs, but also they're going to help us ensure solvency in our entitlement programs. More importantly, as I mentioned, we're going to need them to ensure these population numbers are maintained level, since population numbers are currently at their lowest level since 1920. Migrants are also key for economic and political reasons. They represent economic growth potential, and they're likely to be innovators and entrepreneurs. 1 in 6 migrants is a small business owner, and the largest portion of small business owners are Mexicans. Now, politically, the recent elections in 2012, as we all know, this has been touched upon many times, showed that the Hispanics in the United States are overwhelmingly crucial to politics in this country. And the Pew Center predicts that this electorate is likely to double by 2030. Mexicans are also the largest group of migrants eligible to naturalize, but Mexico is among the last country of the top 10 with the highest number of legal permanent residents. So migrants are playing, and they're going to continue to play an important role, and this is especially true for Hispanics, but more specifically for Mexican migrants. In the past few years, Mexico is also experiencing demographic changes. We've seen declining fertility rates, down from 7.3 in the 60s, now to about 2 children per mother. But we're also seeing declining poverty rates, a growing middle class, and higher amount of years in schooling and higher amounts of access to housing credit. These demographic changes, in addition to stronger border enforcement, a weaker U.S. economy, and a stronger Mexican economy, have combined to really slow considerably the flow of migration of Mexican migrants into the United States. So what we're likely to see is increasingly the next group of low-skilled migrants is going to come from countries other than Mexico. This is already being evidenced sort of on the ground, if you will. DHS estimates that border apprehensions of non-Mexicans in FY 2012 are going to number approximately 90,000. This is about twice the number of FY 2011 apprehensions. And these migrants are going to come from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and pushed by high rates of public insecurity and poverty. Now, what does this mean for U.S.-Mexico relations? While Mexicans are going to continue to migrate, and they may do so if our economy continues to improve, we're unlikely to see the numbers of high migration that we've previously seen, and especially of unauthorized migration. Mexico is also going to solidify its role as the largest legal source of migrants to the United States. And there are going to be some critical implications here for Mexico, given its proximity in the region and its transition from a sending country to a more of a pass-through country. Now, we've also seen that the investment in border infrastructure has deemed that immigration enforcement is the priority federal criminal law enforcement, and that's based on financial resources committed to this issue and personnel committed to this issue. But we're also seeing that at the same time we have these high levels of spending, it's coinciding with the lowest level of Border Patrol apprehensions. So it's important to note that of the entire immigration detention, there are more individuals in the immigration detention system than those serving sentences in federal prisons. And more than 50% of those who have been tried for federal criminal prosecutions are for immigration-specific cases. Now, while Obama has shifted enforcement away from workplace raids and prioritized sanctions on employers, more still needs to be done in this area. We should consider enforcement less focused between the ports, as Chris said, and more at the ports as a prioritization, as well as alternatives such as the prioritization and removal of criminal aliens. Only half of those deported from the U.S. have a criminal record. If you guys will turn to page 33 of the report, you'll see a chart there that shows that in FY 2011, 149,000 individuals were deported for non-criminal offenses, while 145,000 individuals were deported for criminal offenses. So again, there are opportunities for U.S. and Mexico to collaborate on these enforcement issues. Currently, Mexico's immigration agency lacks funding, personnel, and it faces issues of internal corruption. Helping Mexico develop a professionalized border agency that has increased oversight over its officers and that has stricter punishment for those who are committing human rights abuses can make sure or assist that while this is a politically difficult thing to do, Mexico is better managing the legal flow of migrants. Another key area would be for Mexican and U.S. officials to address human smuggling networks along the U.S. Mexico border and clamp down on organized crime that's trafficking in persons. In addition to the changes in our enforcement strategy and the changing demographics I've already mentioned, these are already impacting the U.S.-Mexico relationship. It's important that we commit resources to human capital development. It's crucial that we give communities the tools to capitalize on employment opportunities in the region. And Central America and Mexico can prioritize education and employment training programs that do just that, connect industry, academia, and government in clusters of development to try and assist these communities. There are already models like this in Baja California and the aerospace industry and some other states in Mexico. We should also explore ways that Mexico can help migrants fully bank their remittances. It's crucial that we do this. Migrants often return from the United States with skills, interpersonal skills, social skills, and they're often more likely to settle in Mexico and become entrepreneurs. And so if we can provide ways for them to tap into local labor markets that are trained with clerical skills or business skills, and at the same time give them access to quick capital and credit, then they can start their own businesses, and we can ensure that those businesses are going on to produce more employment opportunities for those in the region. Now, all the sections that I've mentioned aside, the most important or one that's crucial is the urgent need for legal reform to the U.S. immigration system. Now, some of this remains to be seen with what happens with the Senate bill, but this is an economic priority, it's a security priority, but it's also a human rights issue. We absolutely need a system that manages immigration flows in an efficient manner and ensures that we retain our competitive edge. One of the clearest ways to do that is to offer STEM visas to graduates who are already in the United States. The U.S. Department of Commerce estimates that between 2008 and 2018, STEM jobs are going to grow 1.7 times faster than non-STEM jobs. Of all the post-secondary degrees awarded in 2009, only 10.7% were in the STEM field. Only 7% were awarded to Hispanics. So it's critical that we also bring the undocumented out of the shadows, and especially the dreamers. Now, there are estimates that approximately 1.5 million individuals could benefit from such a program, but 68% of those individuals are of Mexican origin. While we need high-skilled immigrants, we also need medium-skilled and low-skilled immigrants. So simplifying the visa guidelines and reclassifying the traditional skill measures of who we decide to take into the system could help reduce the desire to migrate illegally by offering a variety of legal channels. So the Senate bill also does a bit of that, and it's quite interesting. Finally, migration reform is going to carry consequences for both countries and, of course, the bilateral relationship. It's going to be key for Mexico and the U.S. to discuss the implications of these legislative changes, which are, of course, a U.S. issue. But Mexico is going to be a key partner in implementing these changes once they occur. Going forward, our efforts are going to need to further target deportation towards those who have been convicted of major crimes, violent crimes especially. We're going to need to continue to invest in human capital in the region. And we're going to need to make sure that changes to our legal immigration system help better serve the interests of the U.S. and Mexico and help them manage flows more efficiently and contribute to the growth of our economy. Thank you all, and I'll happily turn it over to Andrew, who is my co-author, and without his insights, I wouldn't have been able to put this report together, so thank you all very much.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you, Eric and Chris and Duncan. We've been talking with you for 55 minutes, so I'm going to take less than 5 minutes, and then we'll have a dialogue here. And my job is to play cleanup batter, anything that hasn't been talked about. So I'm going to just quickly run through what people have said and then point out one issue we haven't talked about, which is education, which I think you may see play an important role in this discussion. I want to reemphasize there really are two issues that I think are the backdrop to this discussion, and one that to the meeting between the presidents, and then one that will be the public issue. The backdrop is, as Eric talked about, security. Security cooperation will not be talked about publicly as much as it has been in the past, but that doesn't mean it won't be there. It continues to be a major issue between the two countries. Impunity and violence continue to be major issues in Mexico. This continues to be driven by the U.S. consumption of narcotics and U.S. consumers spending money on narcotics, which is then sent back to Mexico, sometimes invested in arms trafficked across the border, and that hasn't gone away. And so figuring out how the two countries coordinate going forward is a big issue. There are legitimate concerns, I think, about the fact that some of the cooperation has slowed down, but we may actually see coming out of this discussion a better idea of how to coordinate. I mean, the past few years have been let many flowers bloom. Perhaps what we will see come out of this is a more strategic approach. Some things may be lost in the process, but there also may be some gains in thinking about how do you prioritize violence reduction. In the past, we've had a bit of a scattershot approach, which dealt with violence, but also dealing with the kingpin strategy, trying to take off leaders. There were reasons to do it. It perhaps was the only thing that the two governments could have done initially. But there are, perhaps we're at a point where you can think much more strategically about how you take down organizations as a whole, how you go after their finances, and how you prioritize those organizations and those activities that do the most violence to society. So just emphasizing what Eric has said, I think you will see an attempt to sort of centralize, strategize, and coordinate better. Even if the two leaders don't talk about it a lot, it's the backdrop of the conversation. Migration, as Miguel talked about, clearly is going to be a major backdrop to this. Clearly, President Obama sees this trip as a chance to make a case for what has changed next door in Mexico and why we are not necessarily looking down the road at the same kind of migration. Migration has dropped from Mexico, particularly undocumented immigration. Legal immigration has dropped significantly from Mexico. It's up from Central America, but as Miguel said, it really has dropped, and all eyes are on the U.S. reform process that Miguel talked about. And so I think this is a backdrop to both, though we may not see much public statement on this. Clearly, President Obama will position things in such a way that is part of the immigration debate, and President Peña Nieto will clearly in private insist on the Mexican position on this, even though the Mexican government may not want to jump into the public policy debate in the United States. And as Miguel said, I think it's important to think also what happens next. I mean, do two thought experiments, and I'm not sure if the two presidents will do this yet, but we should all be doing this, which is if immigration reform passes, what happens next? Right? Are there ways at a strategic moment, and this will be a strategic moment, for once the U.S. will look really good, by the way, on this issue, and Mexicans will actually feel also a great sense of opportunity here, particularly those who have family members in the U.S. who've been waiting for papers. This is a good moment to take advantage of, diplomatically, but also in terms of thinking of how do we develop what Miguel talked about, human capital, right? How do we take advantage of this moment to think not just people going through a legal process, a few new programs for people to come across the border, but how do we make sure that the opportunities going forward really allow us to invest in people's human capital on both sides of the border so we increase our competitiveness? And that's a key challenge. And if it doesn't pass, that's also an issue, right? And then what comes next? And what are the ways? I mean, I think comprehensive reform will be around for a while if it doesn't pass now. but at the same time, we should be thinking of what are the next steps, what are the things that can be done piece by piece, perhaps as a backdrop while legal reform is still on the back burner. So just keep that in the back of our minds. I think that's the question of human capital, something we'll be discussing on Monday, by the way, for those that are free at 9:30 Monday morning. If I can do a quick announcement, at the Press Club, National Press Club, report done by Migration Policy Institute and the Woodrow Wilson Center on regional migration, Central America, Mexico, and the U.S., looking at the human capital side, chaired by former President Ernesto Cedillo of Mexico, former Secretary Carlos Gutierrez of the U.S., and former Vice President Eduardo Stein of Guatemala, and a cast of thousands. We'll be presenting this report at 9:30 at the Press Club, so hope you can join us for that. Let me say the final issue, which Chris and Duncan have already covered so ably, is the economic cooperation. I mean, this will be the center point of what they talk about. It will be the main message. It will be the most important topic that they bring up. And here there are just enormous opportunities. I mean, to recognize that, in fact, our economies are linked together, that, in fact, we're tied together by production sharing arrangements, not just conventional trade, but, as Chris told us, real production sharing, that our energy resources are developing in different and new ways on each side of the border. There are just huge opportunities going forward. And I think to finish up, I think one issue that they will touch on that will be new, it'll be different, it'll be interesting. It probably will not be earth-shattering at this moment, but it creates an opportunity to grow it over time, and that's education cooperation. This is an issue that we've bounced around the margins for a long time, but there is an opportunity to think of how Mexico can take advantage of being next to the country that has the strongest graduate education system in science and technology. Doesn't mean we have the strongest students, by the way. And many people who are in science and technology graduate education in the United States are not Americans, right? I mean, that's a whole other debate in this country, why Americans don't take advantage of this. But Mexicans also don't take advantage of it. In Mexico, Vietnamese do, Chinese do, Indians do. I mean, there's a number of countries that actually take very good advantage of graduate education, particularly in science and technology in the United States. We are not among them, and Mexicans are not among them. But there's a huge opportunity. I'm exaggerating, but it is a legitimate debate in this country of why we don't actually, particularly at a graduate level, why so few Americans are going into STEM. But it's also a valid question why so few Mexicans are. Right, and really is, I believe, on graduate side, I believe it's ninth. Mexico is ninth. Whatever we say in the report is the right number. I believe Mexico is ninth on graduate education, ninth country, despite the fact that we are actually next door to each other, that Mexico has a fairly robust educational system. And this is something the Mexican government is clearly focusing on. At the same time, in the U.S., where we say that we want Americans to become more globally aware, to have language abilities and cultural competencies that go beyond what you can gain just from living in this country, and where President Obama has talked repeatedly about trying to send 100,000 students to Latin America, another 100,000 exchange with China, we actually are not doing very well. Actually, very few Americans go to Mexico, and we're not doing that well overall in educational exchange. And there's a huge opportunity here to increase bilateral educational exchange, at least at a university and graduate level. It's probably not symmetrical. What Americans need is probably more on semester and year-long programs. That's probably more what Americans will go for rather than full degrees in Mexico. Mexicans are looking, and probably more at undergraduate than graduate level, Mexicans are looking more at graduate education and perhaps either a year or actual degrees in the United States. This is not a symmetrical issue between the two countries and the two governments, but it is a huge opportunity, and I think we will see an initiative come out. It may not have a lot of specifics yet, but at least will be a commitment from the two governments to study how they can launch something on educational partnership going forward. And I think that's a new area that could create some exciting opportunities going forward. And it ties into what Miguel talked about on the human capital side as well, how we develop this. So.
Thank you, Andrew. Before opening up the floor for questions, I'd like to recognize our dear friend Lazaro Cardenas, senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. Perhaps we can call on you at some point to participate in this discussion about where we're going with the bilateral relationship. Very much to hear your views. But at this moment, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions or comments that you have. If you could announce yourself, your name and your affiliation.
Hi. Well, my name is Jose Lobo. I'm from Mexico, and I'm a Georgetown graduate student on international development, not science and technology, unfortunately. Well, my question was for Eric. As you mentioned, the bilateral cooperation among the two countries has been shifted. But what are your thoughts on the Merida initiative? Do you think that's going to change? Do you think that's has been working. I mean, I know the amount of money is not that huge, but I think the technology and the knowledge transfer and the local capacity building in Mexico has kind of worked well. So I don't know what are your thoughts about that?
I think there are two sort of, I don't know, contradictory things might be too strong, but two things happening at the same time. One, on the one hand, there seems to be a lot of bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress for assisting and continuing to engage with Mexico, in the framework of the Merida Initiative or some other framework. But engagement on security policy in the U.S. With Mexico in the U.S. Congress is not a particularly controversial issue, and there seems to be a lot of support there. At the same time, the aid package that's sort of on the table right now is on hold because, fairly or not, there are people in Congress who say things are changing in Mexico, and Mexico has not defined yet exactly how they're going to use our money. So we're not going to send money until we know precisely what's going to happen. And one of the things that caused some degree of irritation in Congress was the closing down of the Secretariat for Public Security and the absorbing of the federal police into Gobernación, into the Internal Affairs Ministry. Some people felt like the U.S. had invested a lot of money in the creation of the federal police, the Policía Federal, a lot of money in Plataforma Mexico and other elements, and didn't really understand why suddenly these things were either dissolved or absorbed into other ministries. And so there was there's a stepping back of saying, wait a minute, until we have clarity about what the Mexican government wants to do in these various areas, we aren't prepared to send a blank check, or never a blank check, that's probably the wrong word, but we're not prepared to send the money that's in discussion. So that's why I say there's a little bit of contradiction here. Support, but also holding back to see how those policies are actually defined. And if I had to predict at some point, this will move forward, but probably not, with the brand name Merida Initiative, some new way of branding and talking about that relationship. So we're in that in-between stage.
Dave Nelson.
Thank you very much. Dave Nelson with GE. First of all, thank you for the great presentation and the excellent thoughts here. Some really good ideas. I have three issues I'd like to touch on real quickly, if you don't mind. First of all, on energy, Duncan, thank you very much for the excellent for pointing out the efficiency gains to be obtained from energy integration, physical integration across North America. Those are great points. Of course, the other aspect is the cost side, the pricing side. And as you know, NAFTA did not include free trade in energy. Prices in Mexico on energy are set bureaucratically rather than by markets. The question is, do you see, and as a result, there's an impact on manufacturing. The fact that electricity prices in factories in Mexico are 17% higher than in the U.S. has an impact on our joint manufacturing competitiveness. Do you see any possibility that energy reform will include something closer to market pricing for energy? Second issue for Chris, on the cross-border transportation issue, have you looked at, obviously the thickening of the border is an important piece of it, but have you also looked at other issues that could be affecting that, such as the reality or the fear of violence in the cross-border areas for trucks on the roads, and secondly, the growth of alternative transportation mechanisms, aviation, and perhaps more importantly, railroad transportation, whether it's for cost or security factors. And then finally, a suggestion, I think also for Chris, on the point about joint manufacturing and how much value added is sort of jointly produced by both countries. One suggestion, a thought that could be looked at as a policy idea is joint export financing. When the Export-Import Bank is financing a U.S. export, they require a certain amount of U.S. content. And if 30% of the product was manufactured in Mexico, they don't qualify. But if there were a simple mechanism, one window where you can jointly finance between Exim Bank and its Mexican counterparts for an export to Brazil or somewhere else, that could vastly simplify and recognize this joint manufacturing. Thank you.
Very nice. Let me just begin with the question of energy. So I had discussions last week in Mexico City with David Penchina, the president of the Energy Commission in the Senate, and his insistence right now is that this is not going to be an oil reform. It's not an oil and gas reform. It's an energy reform. And he says, look, the key thing here is that if we're going to go through all of this, we may as well, change as many things as we possibly can, fix as many problems as we possibly can. And he actually emphasized the need for focusing on electricity. But he didn't talk about the pricing issue. And I think that there's an enormous amount of resistance to that. I think that what they're looking at is the possibility of actually getting more private participation in the generation side of things, which is already possible in Mexico, but they want to increase that. But the flexibility on pricing is going to be a very, very controversial issue. The current government, as you know, is continuing to remove the subsidy on gasoline in Mexico, which has been a controversial issue, the gasolinazo in Mexico over recent years. It was begun under Calderón, and whether or not they're willing to sort of free up pricing for the business side of electricity consumption, which might imply costs for the residential side, is unsure. So at the moment, this is very, very undefined. I think that what we do see the potential for, though, is that if CFE can get new sources of fuel, so cheaper gas to produce electricity, that's where the energy savings are to be found, I think. And then you need to see a much more flexibility in the setting of prices at the centralized basis. But that's going to be, it's interesting because everybody is focusing on the oil and gas side of things right now. But there is the beginnings of a debate over what to do with electricity. But it's largely in the context, my understanding, of diluting the oil and gas debate. It's not really with the idea of saying, we need to fix these problems. I think it's that, it was said very clearly by a Mexican colleague of mine last week. It says, look, if you talk about an oil and gas reform in Mexico, everybody goes to their corners, they put on their shirts, and they say, right, this is what we believe, and we're not going to budge from that. He says, if you talk about energy reform, then you're more likely. And I said, well, really, is that the case? I'm not sure if that actually flies, because as soon as you talk about energy, the first thing everybody thinks about is oil and gas, and they go to their corners. So it may be a little sort of trick that will not work ultimately in the end. Chris?
Yeah, thanks for the questions and comment. On the joint export financing, I haven't looked into that issue, but it's a very interesting one, and I'd love to hear more about it and consider that. In looking at trucks versus at the border, the truck crossings, just sort of looking at the timing of when we have seen increases and decreases over the last 10 years, it doesn't seem to be linked to violence issues in particular. But on the personal side, on the personal vehicle side and pedestrian side, there's been absolutely a correlation between violence in border cities and the amount of crossings that we have. As individuals that live in Ciudad Juarez moved to stay in El Paso for several years, they stopped crossing every day. And so you saw those numbers change a lot. But you didn't see the same thing happening on the trucks. So I think that while there, I'm sure security factors into decisions about logistics to a certain extent, I don't think it's been a driving factor. I think that efficiency has, and we have seen small increases in the use of flights and increases of rail. The first new rail line across the border is open for, the first new rail line in a century. So there's absolutely growth there. But those are natural growths, I think. This is the development of better infrastructure in Mexico, allowing some of the logistics techniques that we've been using in the U.S. for a while. Intermodal in the United States has been hugely important and will be increasingly important in Mexico also, especially for industries like the auto industry. I mean, Mexico has a comparative advantage over China, over other parts of the world in serving the North American market for sort of bulky goods, right? Things like cars, things like pieces of airplanes, white goods, stoves, refrigerators, et cetera. And those are just the types of things that can benefit from intermodal, from train use. And then aviation, I think as Mexico's airport infrastructure improves over time, we'll see more of that. And one of the really interesting new developments there is the customs pre-clearance pilot project that's happening in Laredo right now. So Laredo, which is on the U.S. side of the border, will be shortly. It hasn't been implemented yet, but everything's sort of ready to go there. Will be flying Mexican domestic flights out of there for freight. So they'll have Mexican their customs inspectors on the U.S. side inspecting cargo and then declaring a flight a domestic Mexican flight, meaning that they can access any airport, not just airports in Mexico that have customs facilities. So to the extent that we can sort of expand on that sort of a model, we'll really be able to see air cargo be able to take an even more important role in regional production. And again, there's also a comparative advantage that Mexico has that should be tapped into along with air. Air, of course, isn't for the big, bulky, heavy products. It's for the time-sensitive products, right? Because you have to pay an extra amount to use it. But time-sensitive products are, again, one of the areas where Mexico has a comparative advantage because you don't want to wait the 6 weeks or whatever it takes to get a product across the Pacific on a boat. And it's more expensive to fly something across the Pacific. But using air cargo as a tool for custom-built products that need to get to a factory in a certain time or to a customer in a certain time frame for them to be of value to that customer will certainly benefit from advances in that type of logistics.
Thank you, Chris. There's a question over here somewhere. Yeah, please.
Margaret Daly Hayes. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to ask just a few. Duncan, you didn't talk you mentioned, but you didn't go into the issue of water in the shale gas exploration and how important is that? And Chris, I wonder whether you can comment on this sense that we've kind of lost the excitement about U.S. Mexico relations in the private sector, maybe even as well. I was director of the Council of America Washington office while we were doing starting up NAFTA, and you could feel a lot of excitement. What has happened, and what can we anticipate perhaps doing to stimulate some of that? And then, Andrew, you commented on education, but you focused almost entirely on tertiary and graduate education. But it would seem to me that if Mexico is going to become competitive for the long term, it's going to need to focus on primary and then secondary education. Are there areas that, if there's a reform, that we might be able to help there? And in this whole migration issue, and also in perhaps on the economic side, can we really talk about Mexico-U.S. relations without dealing with Central America? Because the pressure on the border is likely, as you said, to come from Central America in the future.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll be very, very quick. I mean, the water issue in terms of shale gas exploitation in northern Mexico is, I mean, nobody has any clue right now about how they're going to resolve that. It's a sensitive issue in Texas, but Texas has much better water infrastructure than states like Coahuila. And if you've been up to Coahuila in recent years, I mean, the drought that has hit Texas hard has hit Coahuila even harder. When I was there about a year ago, I asked local government officials, I said, so what are the farmers doing now? And they said, well, they're not farming. And it's simple as that. I said, so what are the plans to actually put in place infrastructure to store water for the future? They said, yeah, we've talked about that. but there aren't really any plans. And so I think this is going to be one of the major issues. Now, you speak to folks in the energy industry, and they always tell you, well, we're very good at recycling water. We're very good at, minimizing our water use. Technology is moving ahead very, very quickly. They're talking about, new forms of fracking that will use much less water. But I think that's going to be a serious impediment to the rapid development of the sector in Mexico, and it's another reason why it makes a lot more sense right now to build more pipelines across the border to bring in cheap U.S. gas to satisfy Mexican energy needs.
I think you're right, and you've sort of seen it up and close, right? This loss of excitement that's happened. I mean, one of the sort of obvious reasons for it is that when you had NAFTA on the table, you have a single big thing around which everyone can rally. So you have a single clear agenda that matters to so many different types of industry and groups that they can form a conversation and coalitions around. Now the agenda is much more fragmented than that. We're talking about regulatory cooperation, we're talking about customs simplification, we're talking about global trade issues, we're talking about border management, and the list goes on. The challenge then is how do you organize around an agenda that looks something like that? And my suggestion, and I am still struggling with this, would be that we need a sort of a common goal, at least. We need to add a little bit more to the architecture. We know that the idea of competitiveness is a good one. That's a good term to use as we talk about that. Everyone can be on board with that term, improving regional competitiveness. But what does that mean? So what are we shooting for? What kind of competitiveness gains should we get? Should we be more competitive than China, and in what products? And how do we get there? I think we need to fill in that agenda a little bit. And the thing that will happen when we start to do that is other people will get involved in those conversations to help explain how to do that. But also, the president and top officials will have something to talk about again. Right now, they're starting to say the word competitiveness more, and that's a good thing. And they're saying what some of the pieces of the agenda are. But when you have press conference after a presidential meeting between Obama and Calderon, where they go out to the Rose Garden and talk about fixing regulation so that there aren't too many differences between the two countries on regulatory issues, I mean, nobody's paying attention anymore. That's not in the press, and that needs to be in the press because NAFTA is still a sensitive subject, because bilateral economic issues are still sensitive, because the public writ large doesn't know that the United States and Mexico are so interlocked together economically that we have to work together. And just to sort of make it a clear example, I mean, when I talk to companies, they're happy to talk to me about how U.S. and Mexico work together to build goods and how their companies benefit from that. But when I ask them if I can use their company as an example to explain that story, the people start to be a little bit more weary about it, because they are still, from a sort of corporate communication standpoint, concerned that they're going to be on the wrong side of that story when it comes out in the press. So it's a thing we have to be careful about, and everybody needs to get in together so that you can start to get beyond that.
Margaret, to your questions, I mean, you're right that primary and secondary education in Mexico are much bigger issues probably than tertiary education in the short term. But I'm not sure there's a U.S. angle in there, to be honest. It's so politically sensitive. And this is the reality of the bilateral relationship in general, which is, for the most part, are the biggest problems that we have to solve in each of our countries. And we both have big problems to solve. I mean, restarting our economy in this country, moving Mexico ahead, leaping a generation in economic development in Mexico. I mean, we have some real intractable issues on both sides of the border, are things that we have to solve on our own. And then there are points where, and how we solve them matters for the other country. It's not a completely independent phenomenon. I mean, if we get our economy going, it helps Mexico. Mexico grows, it really helps the U.S. But most of the hard work, frankly, we got to do on our own. How we deal with energy, we got to do on our own. How we, and then there become points of contact here and there. Even violence. I mean, as much as we talk about the need for cooperation and it's a circular trade and all that, in the end, most of the solutions we each have to do on our side of the border, and the cooperative solutions are a piece of it. I think education is still, at a primary and secondary level, still too sensitive an issue to touch. And it's, given the history between the two countries, I'm not sure it's something the Mexican government will want the U.S. deeply involved in. I think the one exception are migrants, actually, who do play a role in some specific area, Mexican migrants and Mexican migrant organizations, in building schools, in paying for teachers, even building universities. In one case, I know I've actually, some of us have seen a university campus. I think, Eric, you and I were there. The university campus in Zacatecas, built largely by a Mexican migrant organization. I mean, quite impressive things that have been done by migrants. But again, that is primarily, again, led by civil society, not by the governments. I'm not sure there's a U.S. government role. On the other question, we didn't talk about this, but we do talk about it in the report. In fact, one of the really developing issues in the U.S. Mexico relationship, and this is actually kind of new, is that increasingly we talk about global issues together. Traditionally, we harped on, I shouldn't say harped on, but traditionally we were obsessed with our bilateral issues. There were so many problems that, it was a relationship about solving, problems that we had together and recriminations. Increasingly, as this relationship matures between the two countries, we're actually able to talk about other things, right? I mean, and we actually realize the limits of what we can do together sometimes, and we have to talk about it. So Central America, huge issue in the context of violence. I think that will be on the plate. Actually, I think they will talk about it. And I think President Obama will talk with Central Americans also about not only how they work with the U.S., but also how they work with Mexico and Colombia. I think there's an emerging idea that there has to be more coordination, and that Colombia and Mexico actually can play a strategic role far beyond what the U.S. can play also in working with Central American countries on this issue. I think they're going to talk about Asia. Trans-Pacific Partnership is clearly going to come up. I mean, and there's a move of both countries to address their economic role in Asia. Mexico has been looking at this for a long time, as has the U.S., and obviously in that context, how they work with Canada, the three countries that already have a trade agreement vis-a-vis Asia. I think they'll be talking also about the European trade agreement, the TTIP, because that actually affects NAFTA as well. And so I think that will be on the agenda in terms of how Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, although the U.S. has indicated it will negotiate solo with Europe, that does not want to put Canada and Mexico in. I don't think they've officially said that, but at least we've heard that sort of, sotto voce. But clearly there has to be a way of bringing NAFTA in, and I think the U.S. trade officials are actually aware of this, and certainly Mexican and Canadian authorities are going to remind their counterparts in the U.S. of this. So there's a larger global agenda, and there's a global agenda in Latin America. I mean, Latin America and the Caribbean are also going through a period of immense change, of a certain degree of fragmentation in terms of geopolitics, and I think there will be some conversations about that. And frankly, that's what mature democracies do when they sit down, and mature partners do. And two countries that are of reasonable size is, yes, they talk about their bilateral issues, but they also talk about these larger global issues. And I'm not sure the U.S. relationship with Mexico is the same as the relationship with Canada. There are too many bilateral irritants and problems still for it to look like the U.S. But it looks a lot more like the U.S. relationship with Canada than it used to, which is when the Americans and the Canadians get together, they spend a little bit of time talking about softwood lumber and border installations and all those fun things, but they spend a lot of time talking about the rest of the world. Right, and I think we're headed that direction with Mexico. We're not there, but we're headed that direction over time, and that's a positive development.
Thank you, Andrew. Before we close, I'd just like to point to a couple of new pieces of data that came through this week. One is a study that we're publishing in conjunction with the Chicago Council on U.S. attitudes towards Mexico and Mexicans, which have shown that, in fact, U.S. attitudes have become more pessimistic, more negative towards Mexico and Mexicans in recent years. At the same time, Pew has just studied some data showing that Mexican views towards the United States are improving. And this is a very, very interesting disjuncture here. And I think there's a lot of work that we still have to do as the Mexico Institute to explain what's going on in Mexico to a United States audience. But it's a very interesting example of how perhaps the more positive news that's coming out of Mexico is hitting at a certain level, but it's not really reaching down to the street level here in the United States. I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. I'd like to thank Alison Cordell, Ashley Garcia for helping to organize this event. I'd particularly like to extend a very special thank you to Chris Wilson, who led this project, who got it through from beginning to end, not just as a midwife, but almost as though he actually gave birth to the thing. It was that painful at certain times with us. And so I think I'd like to give him a very special round of applause, and thank you all for coming.
Congratulations. Well done.
Yeah, very good report. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, so this is an interesting idea on the export financing.
You know, you have this joint production. It's a constraint.